she was drugging with Ritalin, the doctor had given it, because he didn't want to focus, because he was traumatized, because his mother was a cocaine addict, right? And I remember she used to drive into school in the morning, she would snort a line of coke before she went, and then in the car he'd have to swallow his cocaine-like pill. And I thought, what a crazy culture that her cocaine use is illegal and would end up with her being criminally punished, and his cocaine-like substances required by the school and mandated by the doctor. What a crazy, what a culture that is f***ed up about how it thinks about altering itself chemically, about children, about connection.
There are new disturbing numbers tonight showing more people died by suicide last year in Kent County than ever before.
In West Michigan's biggest city and across the country, suicides are rising, with the CDC calling it a major public health concern.
And it's related to a lot of the things we talked about as well, the increasing competition, for example. So parents are in such an unequal society. If you have a society like Norway, where if your kid doesn't do well, they're going to have a good life, and if your kid does really well, they're going to have a good life.
Right.
You know, there's less anxiety about, oh, my kid's fallen behind. Here, if your kid falls behind, they could have a really terrible life.
Yeah,
right?
but the counter to that is rich kids don't do well at all.
Oh yeah,
like,
they're miserable as
I mean, that's a real problem.
Yeah,
it's a real problem with kids that don't have to do well.
But I think this you've got a society that drugs kids at the bottom to shut up. These kids in foster care who are traumatized, not being looked after. They're being drugged to just basically make them docile. You've got kids at the top who are drugged to make them compete. You know, I mean, I've got a friend who's a Wall Street banker who put his kid on I can't remember if it's Adderall or Ritalin, one of the stimulant drugs, when he was a young teenager, because he said, but every other kid in the class is on it, so if he doesn't go on it, he's falling behind, right? So you have, I mean, what a sick culture that's giving their children a cocaine-like drug to make them compete in an unnatural way.
And the f***ed up part is it works.
Good evening. Tonight we report on an issue that no one is talking about and very few want to.
The newest Healthy Youth Survey in Washington polls teenagers across the state, and it's revealing a disturbing new trend.
It's something impacting rescuers here in Boston and across the state. These are the men and women who answer our calls for help during our times of crisis. Yet there are many stories that don't make the headlines. Stories with a deeper side.
Within the last 24 hours, 2 students in our community have taken their own lives, one from Valor Christian High School and another from Cherry Creek. For Cherry Creek, this is the second student suicide in the past 2 months.
A sudden string of teen suicides in the tri-state area in the last month has parents, administrators, and teens struggling to find solutions.
3 suicides in the past month, the latest just yesterday.
At Sprague High School in Salem, students are greeted with words of encouragement. These signs of hope sprouted from tragedy after the loss of 3 students who died by suicide last year.
We've got to keep talking about this because it is an epidemic.
This is Harriman High School. From the outside, it may appear like any other school. But starting in June 2017, 6 students who had attended Harriman took their own lives in a single year. Without knowing why so many kids have taken their own lives, or tried to, parents here aren't sure how to keep their children safe. Vute and other parents were concerned that the mounting suicide toll was not being addressed, and resources like counselors were scarce.
We didn't know how to handle it. And this is a misconception that we shouldn't talk about it, right? If you talk about it, it will cause another suicide. And I believe that for the longest time, for those early suicides, I believe that. That's just simply not true.
He was a special one. He was always doing the craziest things. He wasn't scared of anything.
But when Jack died,
and we felt like the school just didn't give us enough support for that suicide.
And other suicides that have happened at neighboring schools this year, according to freshman Nicholas Corsi.
So with all these suicides that have been going on, you know, the schools don't really talk about them, but yet they keep happening. So we just want some sort of change. There needs to be something new going on.
One of the most important things I learned is that these forms of despair, depression, anxiety, addiction. They are meaningful signals, right? They are telling us something. The fact that they have been rising year after year after year, in fact, we're now at the point where average white male life expectancy has fallen in this country for the first time in the entire peacetime history of the United States. That is a signal that is telling us something.
And that's because of drug addiction and
overwhelmingly because of drug addiction and suicide. It's risen to that point. There are other factors going on, like obesity, but the main drivers are overdose and suicide. That is telling us something. If you create a society where people's basic psychological needs are not met, right? Where they have a shrinking number of friends and social connections, where they're taught that life is about money and buying shit and displaying it on Instagram.
One of the most popular stars online, Selena Gomez, is now delivering a surprising message to her followers.
Social media has really been terrible for my generation.
The singer and actress, who boasts more than 268 million fans across Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, telling reporters at the Cannes Film Festival that the platforms are especially awful for young people.
It does scare me when you see how exposed that these young girls and young boys are, and they're not really aware of the news or anything going on. I think it's dangerous for sure. It just scares me, that's all, because I see these young girls and I'll meet them in meet and greets or something, and they're just devastated dealing with bullying and not being able to have their own voice.
The teen suicide rate and rate of teenagers who feel depressed and think about suicide is way up. The number some of them on the Surface Hub this morning, 10th graders, Mimi, sophomores, who seriously considered suicide in the past year, 23% of them said yes. 250,000 teenagers are surveyed every 2 years for the Healthy Youth Survey. This is even more disturbing. 10th graders who actually tried suicide in the past year, 10% of 10th graders said yes.
But what we do is we try to bash every child into one particular mode of being, which actually is designed to prepare them for shitty, deadening work. The reason our schools are shitty and deadening, there's a guy called Alfie Kohn who says every school has an official curriculum and a hidden curriculum. The official curriculum is like history, geography, whatever. And the hidden curriculum is, this is what we're training you to put up with in your life, right?
Right.
And if you've got a society where 87% of people don't like their work, and you're almost twice as likely to hate your job as love your job, part of the job of the school system will be to deaden children so they learn you've got to fucking sit there and shut up and do what you're told, right? So that's not a malfunction of the system, that's an unconscious function of the system, right? So we've got this system where we're bashing these kids to prepare them for this economic system that's making us feel miserable, where they spend most of their time at jobs they find unfulfilling, controlling, and humiliating. You're going to create growing pools of people, so you create this pervasive insecurity in the society.
6 days a week, nearly 60% of South Korean youngsters look for a leg up by adding hagwons on top of their public school load. That kind of dedication, some say obsession, has catapulted South Koreans into the top tier of educational achievement. Korean society is permeated by values reflecting the teachings of the ancient Chinese scholar, but joy of learning is not the sole motivation.
On the other hand, education is a channel for your social mobility. And if you want to become somebody in society, you want to go to a better college, better school, and study certain areas which will bring you higher status and probably higher income.
This hyper-competitive personal drive is what jet-propelled resource-poor South Korea into the top ranks of world economies. Is it ever enough?
I just feel like it's just ongoing and never-ending, and I have to study more and more, and I have to learn new things, but I never felt it's enough.
Takes another toll.
When young students are lagging behind in their classes, they get blamed by their parents, and they blame themselves. And sometimes they blame themselves so hard that it's going to lead themselves to suicide.
A higher percentage of Koreans kill themselves than in any other country in the developed world.
Now, it's an unfortunate fact that South Korea is notorious for its high suicide rate, and this can be seen once again in a new report. South Korea recorded the highest suicide rate in the whole of the OECD in 2016, more than twice the OECD.
Now, Focus today takes us to Japan, where people are literally working themselves to death. Death from overwork, it's known as karoshi in Japanese, is a problem for 1 in 5 companies. Now, that's according to the first government white paper on the subject. The paper released last month shows that about 200 people die from karoshi every year, mainly from heart attacks, strokes or suicide. Well, now the families of the victims are fighting for proper recognition that karoshi is a serious threat to the health of the nation's workforce.
Japanese law allows employees to work a maximum of 40 regular hours a week. Unions can approve overtime hours, but those extra hours are not always recorded by employers. Employees at 1 in 5 firms regularly clock 80 hours of overtime a month. For Terenishi's husband, the mental and physical demands of excessive overtime became too much. He committed suicide after working 14 hours a day for 10 years.
In Japan, people think that they will be liked more if they work longer hours, that they are showing how motivated they are by surviving on very little sleep. We really need to change this bad mentality in Japan, or things will never improve.
And what Professor Kasser discovered loads of really important things about this, but there's a few. We're all a mixture of these things, but we move throughout our lives. And what he discovered is the more you are driven by extrinsic values, the more your life is guided by how you look to the outside, by, you know, what you're trying to get out of life rather than enjoying it, the more you will become depressed and anxious by quite a large margin. There's loads of studies that show this. And also he found that we have become much more obsessed we're much more driven by these values over the last 30 years for all sorts of reasons, partly because from the minute we're born, we're immersed in a machine that tells us life is about consumption, right? About externally consuming things. More 18-month-old children know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name, right? So there's this machine constantly geared towards getting us to think extrinsic. So this movement towards these kind of junk values, but what thinking extrinsically, what being dominated by these junk values does is it jolts you out of the intrinsic value. So imagine, go back to the piano example. If you're playing the piano just because you love it, and then suddenly you think, am I the best piano player in Los Angeles today? Right? How are these people in this room thinking about my piano playing? How much am I going to be paid for this piano playing? You can see how that would jolt you out of the flow state, right? People who, the more we're driven by extrinsic values, the less we get into flow states and the worse we feel. And there's lots of other reasons as well I can talk about, but.
Why Americans are unhappy?
Yes.
I'm not sure. I'm happy.
We put too much emphasis on material things.
I think it's because of social media. I think people are just obsessed with looking at their phones and they're seeing how perfect people's lives are.
Sometimes it makes people feel bad about themselves and they don't even realize it.
I just hope they know that they're worth more than an Instagram like, and they're worth more than a comment on any other social platform.